Here to introduce our speaker tonight from Stanford University and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, Dr. Paul Milgram.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thanks to the National Academy for sponsoring this and for sponsoring us in our conference, those of us who are here and looking forward to studying the dynamics of institutions tomorrow are planning on having a good time. But one of our co-organizers is here to talk to you today, and that's Avinash Dixit, who is the Sherrod University Professor of Economics at Princeton University. And so I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to introduce him tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Avinash Dixit.
So, thank you, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. The bad thing about these great introductions is that it's always downhill from there on. So I'll try and avoid that fate. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Thanks to the National Academy for inviting me, and all the sponsors of this series for sponsoring the talk. Thank you so much, Susan, for her excellent organization of both my talk and the conference to come. I don't know how many of you are here after dinner, but this is going to be something in the nature of an after-dinner talk. There's somewhere in the background some serious content, namely game theory. But I'm going to try and convey some of the ideas of game theory in a very light-hearted way, basically by screening several clips from movies, which many of you would have seen, many of them already. But I think that in many cases you would not have thought of those as conveying any game theoretic ideas. Some people in the audience actually are true experts in game theory and its various applications, Paul Milgram himself among them. So for those, it will be really trivial stuff, but I hope it will be fun anyway. I wanted to title the lecture Fun and Games, but was dissuaded from doing that. So first of all, what is game theory, for those of you who don't know? And I like to phrase it as systematic analysis of strategic interactions. The interaction part is the fate of each person. What you get out of the interaction depends on what everybody else is doing. And the strategic part is that people are aware of this and try and take advantage of what they can do to pursue their best interests. Those best interests don't have to be selfish. They can take into account what's happening to other people, but whatever it is that you care for, which may be in part including what happens to others, you try and pursue strategically. And this is something that we do absolutely all the time. Almost from the time that we are born, we start playing games against our parents to try and evade their discipline or try and not do the things they would like us to do, like tidy up our rooms. We go on to play games against our siblings. We go on to play games against our classmates. We are now involved in games at work, games at home with spouses. All of life is practicing game theory. And all of us, by virtue of playing games, acquire expertise in those specific contexts. you will probably have, if you think of it in this way, been amazed by how good your children are as strategic players of games. Parents usually lose in the games against children. What theory does is to build all of this into a coherent, systematic framework of analysis. However, some of you might say, why do we really need theory at all? And the point is that every situation has some unique aspects to it that you learn only by experience, by context, etc. But also, every situation has some features that it shares in common with other similar situations. What theory does is to establish the general principles that apply for common kind of things across a number of situations. You can't bring theory and apply it 100% to any particular situation, but it gives you a head start. It gives you a foothold on the problem that you can then expand by bringing your context-specific knowledge, experience, etc. And that kind of two-step procedure, bringing in theory to look at the general aspects and experience or knowledge to look at the specific ones, is a really nice mixture of science and art. Think of the science of game theory as the general principles, very often done mathematically, and the art as combining it with your context-specific skills. And I find this combination of science and art really the most attractive part of using game theory in life. How would one learn theory? Well, basically one can learn science from books, articles, etc. And there's a whole lot of formal mathematical literature on this. One of the earliest classics of this was Lucien Raffa's book, Games and Decisions. In fact, many of you may already know Professor Luce either personally or through his reputation. In fact, just a couple of years ago, there he is. A couple of years ago, the 50th anniversary of that book came up, and Don Sari had organized a great conference right here for that. So maybe you should stand up and take a bow, Duncan. One of the first big classics. A number of more recent books, Fudenberg and Tirol is one of the earliest ones written in economics and still used as a textbook about 30 years out. Roger Myerson has another one, and a number of those. And then there are also classic books which exposit strategy with somewhat more practical orientation. And the big name in that is Thomas Schelling, who has written classics like The Strategy of Conflict, and Choice and Consequence is a particularly nice one because it looks at how you deal with your own other self. So what you do in the evening to make sure that your morning self will not hit the snooze button too often when the alarm rings. Issues of that kind, really practical. And lastly, you can look at some examples and cases. And those appear everywhere. That's the literature, sports, movies, etc., part that I mentioned. And today, I'm going to work mostly through movie clips. I will occasionally mention things in literature and sports, but that will not form a big part of what I'm doing now. So the first of these clips is a movie that many of you may have seen yourself. I'm sure a number of your children would have seen it, or you may have seen it when younger, etc. So without further ado, we will screen that, and afterward I'll discuss it a little bit. Now, by the way, those of you who've seen the movie know that there's something else coming. And I'll come to that in just a minute. But right now I want to take the premises of what's happened so far as granted and hold a little discussion on the basis of that. When I do these things in class, I actually have a discussion with the students to try and elicit the game theoretic point out to them. But certainly there isn't time for that, so I'll kind of just give it to you myself. Oh, by the way, the first time I did this in a talk was in Australia, and you can imagine it went down very well. Also, this film was in kind of mid to late 1970s when the land war in Asia was in Vietnam, but you see that the classic blunder still remains a classic blunder. So, where did Vizzini, the Sicilian, go wrong? And the problem was that every one of his arguments was logically contradictory in itself. So he says, are you the kind of man who would put poison into his own goblet? Suppose Wesley is. Then Vizzini should be choosing the cup that's in front of himself. But of course, then strategically, even though Wesley may be the sort of man in some innate characteristics who would poison his own goblet, he should actually poison the one in front of Vizzini. Think through, and exactly the same is true for every one of the arguments. If whatever it is that makes Wesley believe that Vizzini will choose cup A, whatever argument, then Wesley poison the other one. And this kind of situation, I said these are very common things, happens, for example, when you're kicking a penalty in soccer, do you go to the goalie's left or right? If whatever it is that makes the goalie believe that you will go to his left, you should go to his right, and vice versa. Serving in tennis, should you go to the backhand or the forehand? And this is something that then, think it through, will lead to the conclusion that if you're doing anything systematic, the opponent will exploit that to his own advantage and to your disadvantage. Therefore, the correct thing is not to do anything systematic, mix your moves, and in game theoretic technical terms, these things are called mixed strategies. Now, mixing your moves is an idea that even TV commentators in football know about. You hear them talking about that all the time. Or baseball pitches, should you throw a fastball or a curve? All these things have a similar common feature behind them. What mixed strategies do is to keep your opponent guessing and prevent him or her from exploiting your systematic actions to his advantage. This, in fact, was one of the very, very early situations analyzed in game theory, and you could almost say that this was the first big theorem of game theory, the minimax theorem of von Neumann and Morgenstern, which showed how to calculate the probabilities with which you should mix. Not mixing doesn't mean 50-50 necessarily. It could be 30-70 or 60-40. And so I want to give you a little example of that. I told you that there's something serious behind all these light things. Here's just a simple example through a penalty kick story. If both the kicker kicking to the goalie's left and the goalie going to the left are strategies that coincide, the success probability will be low for the kicker, and let me just call that 30%. If the kicker kicks to the goalie's right and the goalie is going to his own right, again, the chance of the goalie saving the kick is higher, chance of the kick succeeding is somewhat lower. Let me call that 50%. These numbers are kind of not totally unrealistic, but they're not meant to be exact. They're meant to keep the calculations simple. Of course, if the goalie goes to the wrong side compared to what the kicker is going, the probabilities will be higher. Let me just call those 90%. Maybe 10% of the time the kick just misses the net completely. What will happen if the kicker kicks systematically to the goalie's left? The goalie will then be able to systematically save by going to his own left, 30% chance of success. For the kicker, systematic right earns only 50%. But what if the kicker mixes going to the goalie's left or to the right with probabilities of 40% to 60%? What are the success rates against the goalie going left? They are 30% of 40% and 60% of 90%. That's 12% plus 54%, 66%. What are they against the goalies going to the right? They're 40% of 90%, that's 36, 60% of 50%, 30, 66 again. They're both higher than either of the systematic ones. Mixing moves has led to an advantage, and it's exploitation proof. The goalie cannot hold you down to a lower percentage by going either to the left or the right. And this is an illustration, just a numerical example of the von Neumann-Morgenstern minimax theorem. I took those 40 and 60 as those that would come out of the solution. You can try other things and see why they would not work quite as well. So this is building up a little bit of relation with formal game theory. The second clip is the kind of classic of the scene in the Nash biography movie, A Beautiful Mind, where supposedly Nash gets his idea for Nash equilibrium. Okay, so the idea is that that's where Nash got the inspiration for his equilibrium, now called the Nash equilibrium, of course, and the rest is history. Is that right? What is the definition of Nash equilibrium? The definition is that each player in the game is following whatever strategy is best for himself, given the strategies of all the others. It's a configuration of strategies so that no player can gain by being the only deviator from it. What Nash proposed there was that nobody go for the blonde. But that's not Nash equilibrium. If all the rest of the people are going for brunettes, then any one, maybe Nash himself, can go for the blonde and get her. This is the sexist 1950s, women have minimal choice in the matter, and if he's the only person going for the blonde, he will get her. So Nash's solution is actually the one depicted in the movie, not a Nash equilibrium. All game theorists are very grateful to the movie for making this mistake. It gives us a very good example to bring up in class to fix the idea of what Nash equilibrium is and what it isn't. And you can do some math with this. What is a Nash equilibrium? And it turns out that if there are n men, there are 2 to the power n minus 1 Nash equilibria. With 4 friends and Nash himself, 5 people, that means 32 minus 1, 31 Nash equilibria. N minus 1 of them are in what's called pure strategies, not mixed ones, where any n minus 1 of the people go for brunettes and 1 goes for the blonde. Given that that's happening, anyone going for the brunettes, although doing less well, is not going to benefit by going for the blonde, because if 2 or more people are going for blondes, remember, none of them will get her, and they'll have lost the brunettes in the process as well. So nobody gains by deviating. Certainly the one who's going for the blonde doesn't want to deviate. Then there are a whole lot of mixed strategy equilibria, which are a little bit more complex to calculate out. But that can be done, and these two University of Virginia economists, Anderson and Engers, have done that and written this neat paper, which of course they titled A Beautiful Blonde. You can easily get the paper by Googling, but if you want to do that, I suggest that you Google it by the names of the authors or Virginia Economics Online Papers. If you Google the title, you will get an entirely different class of websites. So, let's come back and complete the Princess Bride story. So, Vizzini actually completely misunderstood the game that was being played. Wesley was immune to iocane, poisoned both cups, and so he was completely safe no matter. Vizzini chose one or the other, and Vizzini was doomed no matter what he chose. So this, in fact, is true of some of the best strategies. They consist of taking the opponent unaware, and that is largely an art. Game theorists are just beginning to develop formal theories of the concept of awareness in games. There are a few theorems to my mind. It's not made a great deal of progress, but there's a lot of art involved in finding strategies that your opponents will then afterwards say, who would have thunk they could do that? Of course, Vizzini didn't really have time to even say that, but in some circumstances they would. Somewhat similar to these are situations where the opponent knows what's going on, but you make a first move that leaves the other with a fait accompli, and at that point there's not much you can do. Schelling developed the whole concept of these things called strategic moves, commitments, threats, and promises. I mentioned playing against your own future self by trying to make sure that in the morning you would not hit the snooze button too often. You make a commitment by putting the alarm clock on the other side of the room so that you have to get out of bed. That's just an example of these. And a whole lot of the art or the fun in game theory consists of devising things just of this kind. But let's come back to the awareness type story and say a little bit about what one should do in that context. Often captured in the well-known saying, if something is too good to be true, it probably is. And the reason it's too good to be true is that the other person has strategically made it so. So if someone offers, for example, to sell you a house, a car, a stock, or what have you that looks amazingly cheap, you should pause and ask yourself, are they just being stupid? Or perhaps they know something you don't, or perhaps they have made something you don't. So again, we know from a lot of experiences, what people tell us, etc., caveat emptor, you should have due diligence, etc., but you will often in practice forget. No game theory, live game theory, particularly that based on asymmetric information ideas, and you will not forget. Here is an example. This is from Greenspan's autobiography or memoirs. The most effective defense against fraud is counterparty surveillance. JP Morgan thoroughly scrutinizes the balance sheet of Merrill Lynch before it lends. it does not look to the SEC to verify Merrill's solvency. That was written before the financial crisis, and I suggest we now need to change that a little bit. So who was the strategist in these kind of situations? Maybe it was Ronald Reagan, who always kept telling Gorbachev that he'd heard this Russian proverb called trust but verify. Maybe that actually makes sense. So actually in the specific context of the bet that Sky Masterson would not take from Nathan Detroit, what might he have done? And one of the things he might have done is to ask Nathan for what odds he would take the other side of the bet. And if the answer is no, I'll never take the other side of the bet, then clearly Nathan knows something about what's going to happen. This is not mere speculation. In stock trading, for example, at least in the old way of doing things, there was a specialist that you went to the specialist's booth and asked, what's IBM? And he had to tell you the buying price and the selling price before he knew whether you were going to buy or sell. And that served that kind of purpose. If that spread was too wide, then you should start being suspicious. Okay, next one takes you back to your childhoods. In some cases, your children's. So what's this do with game theory? Well, banking is a strategic interaction. And what's more, it's one that can have multiple equilibria. If people think the bank is safe, they don't need to take their money out in a rush. They can leave it in and the bank will be safe. If they think the bank is unsafe, they will all rush to get their money out before it runs out. There'll be a run on the bank, and the bank indeed will fail. And equilibrium can tip from one to the other very easily. In this case, for really no underlying reason at all. Michael wanting his tuppence back had nothing to do with the bank's safety, but the people hearing that misinterpreted it, and they thought the bank was unsafe, and indeed the bank was unsafe. Unfortunately, this tipping is somewhat easier in the direction of going from what you might call the good equilibrium to the bad equilibrium. Once you get into a bad equilibrium, it's much more difficult to build back the reputation and the confidence. And that then says we need a lot of special care, collective effort, including regulation, to try and stop. Well, you can never really stop them, because after all, in a number of cases, there are real underlying reasons for the bank's failure. The bad equilibrium might in that case be the one you have to be in, but you do want to try and minimize those kind of things happening and need external intervention. Okay, from childhood to much more serious stuff. So, before actually discussing the three-person duel, a brief digression on ordinary two-person duels, where the classic story is that these two French aristocrats stand 10 paces apart and start walking toward each other. Question is when to shoot. You want to wait as long as possible so that you're closer and your shot is more likely to hit than miss, but you can't wait too long, because then you might get hit in the meantime yourself. I said lots of situations have these kind of things in common. And what's the more serious situation of this kind? It's the launching of a new product. You want to try and wait to make it as perfect as possible, But if you wait too long, you might get preempted. And that's the trade-off you have to work with, and goes on in especially high-tech or pharmaceutical, etc., industries all the time. There are other kinds of related games of timing where things might be opposite. You want to act first, or do you want to wait for the others to act so that you can get benefit of their actions? So this is the kind of situation where 10 of you are sitting in a very hot room and nobody opens the window because everybody is waiting for others to go and open the window. That's a situation where you want the action to take place as quickly as possible, but you would rather someone else acted. Okay, three-person duel brings in an additional consideration, not just when to shoot, but whom to shoot. And if you have some added information, like one of the others doesn't have any bullets in his gun, that's an immense advantage. So you looked at the eyes of the other two, Eli Wallach, Tuco the bad, and Lee Van Cleef, the angel eyes, Tuco was the ugly and Lee Van Cleef was the bad. They are flicking from one to the other of the opponents. Clint Eastwood is gazing steady. He knows whom he is going to shoot. And of course, that strategic advantage can be brought about by actually going and unloading the other person's gun. Art of strategy, if you like. Incidentally, again as a kind of aside, in a three-person duel, if you are the weakest, it might be to your advantage to exhibit that, or actually pretend to be very weak. So the other two will go after each other, and if they both hit, then maybe you will be the one who survives. Okay, last clip. And a moment before discussing that, let me take this opportunity to thank Kareem in the booth there and his colleagues for the excellent job they did in selecting the videos, embedding them, and running the whole technology smoothly. Thank you, Kareem. So, a little bit of discussion and bringing in again just a little formal analysis. In most bargaining situations, you can show in a two-dimensional diagram where on the horizontal axis you show your outcome, which may be in the form of money or some other metric that you care about, and on the vertical axis, similarly, your opponent's outcome. This line is the bargaining frontier. It's simplest in the case where there's a fixed amount of money to be split between the two of you. General, it might have somewhat more complicated shape, but this is its basic idea. This point, which gives so much to you and so much to your opponent, is what's called BATNA, Harvard Business School negotiation jargon, standing for Best Alternative to Negotiated Agreement. That's where you'll end up if the negotiations collapse. You can do better than that. You can move anywhere along this line. And the idea is that depending on your bargaining strengths, etc., you will end up at some point that lies to the northeast of the BATNA, and let's take it to be exactly northeast. So I draw a line with a slope of 45 degrees, and where it meets the bargaining frontier is where successful negotiation will conclude. You can do this much, much more generally, but the basic idea will suffice. The key thing is that you can move the BATNA strategically sometimes by, for example, making a threat. Suppose you move the BATNA in such a way that the other person's BATNA goes down by a lot and yours goes down by somewhat less. So what you're saying basically is this is going to hurt you much more than it hurts me if negotiations fail. With that new BATNA, the 45-degree line will lie below the previous one, and then the outcome will be there instead of there, and it's moved more favorably to you. You are getting more here, the opponent is getting less here than here. So your strategy of moving the BATNA by making the threat has worked to your benefit. How is that working out in the present case? This axis is now Mullen's, Mel Gibson's outcome, and this is Shaker's, Gary Sinise outcome. If nothing was done, the BATNA, if things failed, would be that Mullen would keep his $2 million, the ransom not paid, but he loses his child, and Shaker, the kidnapper, ends up with no money. That's what happens if negotiations fail and the child is killed. And Shaker then expects that Mullen would give up the $2 million, but get the child. Presumably, Mullen values the child more than he values $2 million, and Shaker gets the $2 million. Mullen is threatening that, I'll accept losing the $2 million and losing the child, but you will end up with no money and lose your own life. And he's kind of betting that Shaker values his own life much more. And starting from that threat point, he hopes to get the outcome where he keeps the $2 million, doesn't have to pay the bounty because he gets the child back, and Shaker gets no money at all. Now, this may or may not work, of course, and this being a movie, those of you who've seen it will realize that actually things happen quite differently than this kind of neat picture suggests. But the idea behind Mullen offering the ransom as a bounty is that. Okay. Lots and lots of more examples once you start thinking along these lines you can think of. In a proper spirit of a class, I'll leave this as homework for you. Probably the best movie that's nothing but game theory in all of its 90 minutes is Dr. Strangelove, which was a nuclear war horror comedy made in 1964. Well worth watching for those of you who haven't seen this. Now, I've screened that in class and then held a discussion, and the summary report of that discussion is available on my website. Susan, I believe, is also going to put it up on the National Academy website associated with this talk, so you can follow it there. Literature I mentioned in the title, but never actually got round to it, but some novels like Les Liaisons Dangereuses is an excellent strategic interaction between all the main actors in that. Michael Che, political science professor at UCLA, some of you may know, had just completed a manuscript analyzing the game theory in novels, or strategy in the novels of Jane Austen. And I've read the manuscript and it's absolutely excellent. Watch out for that book when it comes out. Number of TV shows, some of the challenges in Survivor, or some of the interactions in The Apprentice also bring out very interesting game theoretic ideas. Perhaps in Q&A we might be able to come up with some of those, but that's just the starter. You will start discovering many more things of this kind on your own once you know how to look for them. And in that, how should you use game theory? Don't use it too rigidly. It's not as if there's a theorem that applies 100%. Again, I want to emphasize there's a lot of art involved. You need to take theory and mix it with your experience, knowledge of your particular situation. But don't make the other mistake either. Don't dismiss theory because it doesn't apply 100% to your situation. whatever it applies, maybe 40 or 50%, the science part of it gives you a good head start that you otherwise would not have had trying to analyze situations right from scratch. And in doing that, in using theory in this way, don't worry that it looks too simple. Simplicity in this context is a virtue, actually. You knew some of those ideas all the time, but it's good to be reminded, and you'll then be somewhat more easily able to transfer them, complicate them using the details of your situation as you would like. Leave you with a few thoughts. Knowing game theory, if you look at it the right way, not merely as a bunch of dry theorems. The theorems are important, but there's a lot more to game theory than that. It'll change the way you look at everything, and it'll make you a very different person. Not necessarily a better person, mark you. Maybe you will become a little bit too suspicious. That's a problem. Maybe you will get disliked because you succeed so well, but certainly it will make you a more successful person. But there's also one other thing that I want to add, which is that some of these strategies, particularly things like the commitments, threats, promises, etc., are somewhat risky. And in different contexts, they may not work as you would think merely from the science that they should work. So practice these things at your own risk. If you fail, don't sue me. Here's the Art of Strategy book and some other things that are available. Thank you very much.